Welcome back to my fourth tutorial. Since I just wrapped up a remix for Adele's track When We Were Young, I thought no better time like the present than to do a walkthrough of my remix and then show you how I bounced the stems for mixing. I'm going to break this up into two parts. The first will focus on the remix, and the second video will be on bouncing stems. Even though I was asked to do this remix, we couldn't get a hold of an acapella, so what we ended up using was a mastered wave of the album version. Now, with most songs of this nature, there is a live element which makes it that much more difficult to work with, as opposed to an electronic track which for the most part is locked to a sequencer. What made this even more of a challenge was the fact that even though for the first half of the song it's mostly Adele, piano, and bass, as the song progresses, so does the arrangement and more instruments are introduced, and her delivery, although flawless, was sometimes loose and there was some timing issues between the vocals and the piano. The first challenge, even before I began trying to lock it to a BPM, was figuring out how I was going to remove as much of the bass and drums as possible without making it sound too thin. For this, I just used the stock Ableton EQ8 and I used it in mid-side mode. How this mode differs from stereo mode is this allows you to EQ the middle and sides independently by clicking here to toggle back and forth. I was able to carve out enough of the bass and drums using this method without thinning the vocal. I would have liked to retain some more low end, but the mids and the bass were pretty bottom heavy and interfered with the mix. The next step was locking the track to Ableton's master tempo. The original was 142 or 71 BPM, so I knew I was going to have to lower the BPM to make it work, and I toyed around with several different BPMs but ultimately settled on 121. From there, it was a full day of warping, sometimes individual words, beats, whatever it took to get the timing to feel right over the sketch beat that I laid down. Now you can see some of that here. As I click on these yellow dots are warp markers. And yes, I will be doing a tutorial on warping soon. But each one of these represents a place where I had to move that particular part to get it to sit right, because it was a little loose. I doubled the piano to make it stand out more, and in the bridge to the chorus, played some piano stabs to give it a little more movement. Here's the MIDI down here. For the sounds, I used two instances of the Korg M1. One was playing the Korg M1 house piano, which everybody knows, and the other one was playing a more traditional sound. What I did then was froze and flattened those two to free up CPU power, but I left this one down here in case I need to make any changes. On both of the piano channels, I used the stock glue compressor with a high threshold to give it a more compressed feel, and I also used an EQ8 with some of the lows and highs rolled off. On the second piano, I actually rolled off the lows a little more and I threw a simple delay on it. Now I didn't use a simple delay for an actual delay or echo effect, I actually used it to make the sound stereo. Now what I do to get that effect is I make sure the dry wet is all the way at 100, feedback is at 0, and on your left and right here, you make sure they're set to time and that link is off. Now on your left channel, you bring it all the way down to 1 millisecond. And on the right channel, you can experiment with different times till you get the desired effect. The higher you go, the more the left or right sound is going to be separate from each other. And if you go too high, you start to get a slapback effect. But what this sound does is with it off, it sounds like this. With it on, it sounds like this. So again, with it on and off. You can hear how it sounds wider and then sounds a little more in the middle when I turn it off. I didn't want the arrangement to start getting cluttered or take away from the feeling of the original, but I felt like it needed something more. So I took the MIDI from the piano, brought it up to a new track, and started messing around with a couple sounds until I came up with this, which is just a sound from the Nexus. It's from their stock arpeggios, Baroque, Renaissance. It's just basically playing eighth note intervals that follow the chords of the piano. You layer them together. When I listened to the sound, I said, you know, that might sound cool in the beginning. So I filtered that in. Next, we get down to the bass group. As you can see, the bass sound is made up of 4 layers, and it sounds like this. So the first layer is basically an FM bass sound from Nexus's XP House Volume 3 expansion. And that sound carries most of the weight. And then we come down to this sound, which is the obligatory M1 organ sound. Now I also added that simple delay stereo trick. So basically this is just kind of making the sound a little wider. Then next is a sound from Yamaha's TX81Z called the Lately Bass Patch, which is not Nexus. It's actually a sample, a one-shot from Simpler. And then lastly, I have this Future Bass patch from Deep House called Future House 1, surprise. And you can't really hear it, but it comforts me knowing that it's there. I didn't do a lot of processing. I rolled off some of the low end on the organ since it's mostly on the sides, and I rolled off some of the low end on the rest of it since the main bass is carrying the extent of the low end. On the group, I threw a stock glue compressor to the group with a low threshold just to catch the peaks since most of the sounds I'm using are samples. And I also have an EQ8, which isn't doing much here, but I have it modulating the low frequencies out in certain places to make it sound like it's filtering out, which is basically like a high-pass filter. Now we get down to the drum group. For the kick, I actually ended up comping the kick and clap I used in the demo because I liked the way it cut through the mix, so that stayed. I threw 2 instances of the EQ8 on the channel. One has the low end rolled off at about 250 Hertz, and I turned that on when I want to drop the low end. The other one just has a notch around 3 kilohertz that basically cuts out the bite of the clap. When I start working on a record, I tend to load up a drum rack with a bunch of sounds and fool around till I find a cool groove. Then I will freeze and flatten it to make it easier to work with as a loop. Even though sometimes it's overkill, for this particular session, I ended up with 2 loops that I really liked, and I used EQ8 to carve out some frequencies so they fit well together. The first one is this, which just basically a shuffly hi-hat with a clap. And the second one is this, which has a more pronounced hi-hat and a clap with a little tambourine accent. And then together. So nothing crazy. I just like the way they sound together and they fit really good in the mix. And on this, the EQ8, I ran it in mid-side mode. And you can see how I EQ'd the mid and side differently if you take it off with it on. Then I usually like to bring in a tambourine or a shaker as an accent during like bridges and choruses. I have about 6 or 7 that I've used over the past decade that really cut through a mix. For this track, I actually ended up using it more than I usually do, but it sounded really good in it, so I left it alone. Some of the other sounds I have are a 909 crash with a little bit of cymbal delay. I have a 909 snare roll. That's just basically a 909 sample and a drum rack. It's got some EQ8 and a reverb that I'm automating the dry and wet as well as the decay time. So as the pattern progresses, the reverb gets more pronounced and longer. I also have the obligatory 909 hi-hat, which I comped into a loop. I added a little EQ8, and I added that simple delay trick on it to make it sound wider, which you can hear if you're in headphones with it on. Without it, it sounds right here. This way, it's a little wider. That sound and that trick kind of works on percussion, hi-hats, claps, anything you want to give a little space to, but don't use a ton of it because then you're taking away from the middle. Last but not least, we have the effects group. That contains all the transitional effects, uplifters, down filters, sweeps, things like this drum fill. On that, just a simple EQ and a little bit of compression to even it out because it is a live loop. And, sweeps like this. That one's got a little more of a filter sweep on it. This one kind of takes you to the beach. It's got a little nice wave effect. Just smoother. I made that on Synth. This one's probably the most complex of any of the effects I used in this. It's basically just a synth with like a rising LFO rate into a sweep. And that I got from a Vengeance sample pack or something like that. There's some sub drops. I use those in the breakdowns. And there's I just use that to accent certain claps before things come in and out. And this kind of laser sweep that I use to transition into the bridge and chorus. And that is pretty much it. So that's it for part 1 of this tutorial. Part 2 is going to be me showing you how to bounce stems that you can use for your own mix session or to send off to an engineer for mixing and mastering, or if you need to have someone remix the record. And in case you were wondering, yes, I do buy the software I use. Because if you don't, that would be evil.
Did somebody say evil? You know what would be evil? Not subscribing to Strobe's social media page. That would be evil. I would expect that maybe from Perry the Platypus, but not from you watching this video at home.